Welcome to week two. The lecture is Kennewick Man and the Ethics of Indigenous History. So, the study of Indigenous history, especially before the arrival of European colonizers, has usually been the preserve of anthropologists and archaeologists. Although historians have begun to wade into this area roughly in the past 20 years, but because of the dominance of anthropology and its subfield of archaeology, I want us to spend some time thinking about these two academic disciplines, how they evolved over time, and the biases inherent in their approaches. The second big thing I want us to do in this lecture is to really think about the ethics of researching Indigenous history. I want us to remember that even though we're studying the deep past, we're studying a time that's incredibly far away from us. We're studying the lives of people who actually lived, real live people. So that's why ethics comes into play. Plus, these real live people, their ancestors today, their many times removed ancestors currently live in North America. So I want us to be wary and careful in thinking about how to be respectful historians. So this lecture has 5 sections to it, and the first section is we're going to be looking at the history of anthropology and its study of Indigenous people. The second section is going to be on retribalization. The third section is principles of respectful Indigenous history. The fourth section is called Skull Wars, and the fifth section is called Kennewick Man. Section 1, History of Anthropology and its Study of Indigenous People. In its simplest form, the discipline of anthropology is the study of humankind from the angles of the comparative study of human cultures and societies, which is called cultural anthropology, and secondly, the science of human zoology, evolution, and ecology, which is called physical anthropology. Archaeology, as a subfield, is the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts and physical remains. So it's a methodology. American anthropology emerged roughly in the mid to late 18th century as a discipline devoted to gathering information about America's indigenous people, especially since Americans thought indigenous people were disappearing. The earliest anthropologists argued that indigenous people should be studied as part of nature, and they wanted to know about things like family structure, economics, technology, and religions. Now, at the time, historians thought these things were trivial, and historians were pretty much only interested in like royal families, so kings and queens, empires, the birth of nations, and great men. So, Indigenous people were only studied by anthropologists, and anthropologists treated them like specimens in the same way they treated, say, like mammoth bones. So, in the 19th century, anthropology became grounded in the doctrine of racial determinism. People believed that there was a direct correlation between heredity and behavior. So cultural differences were inherited through the biology of a person. So this was well before anybody knew anything about DNA or genetics, but they really thought that cultural behavior was quote unquote in the blood. So theories of racial determination were based on a person's inherited physical makeup. For physical anthropologists, then, human skulls became a means to scientifically study a race, and by conflating cultural differences and disparities in human intelligence, scientific racism created a global cultural hierarchy. Let's take a look at the drawings of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. As early as 1779, he had drawn all these human skulls in order to illustrate what he considered to be 5 races within the human species, 5 races. And then in the 1790s, he grafted these ideas right onto his skull drawings here. So his 5 races were the Caucasian race, the Mongoloid race, the Malay race, the Negroid race, and the American race. Later on in the mid 20th century, in the 1940s, actually, scientists added on the Australoid race, and in the early 1960s, the Capoid race. And altogether, then, these seven groups today are known as traditional racial classifications or historical definitions of races. And these groupings are still used today in historical anthropology, especially describing human migration, and also they're used in forensics. So Blumenbach's classification of the Mongolian race included all East Asians and some Central Asians, but he considered people of South Asia and the Pacific Island to be part of the Malay race. He considered American Indians to be a completely separate race from all Asians, and he then called them the American race. He didn't necessarily start creating hierarchies right away, so he didn't think that the American race was inferior to the Caucasian race, and he actually thought that the American race had the strong potential to become good members of society. But over time, he started to argue that physical characteristics like skin color, like the cranial profile, and so on, were determined by geography, nutrition, and custom. So, all of those things all together, where people lived, what they ate, and how they behaved, created these physical characteristics that classified people into a race. So the 19th century saw attempts to change race from a taxonomic to a biological concept. And scientists made three big claims about race. First, they claimed that races were objective, naturally occurring divisions in humanity. Second, they claimed that there's a strong relationship between biological races and culture. And third, their most obvious claim was that race was a valid scientific category. Let's turn to another example. This example is from the mid to late 19th century. Thomas Huxley, who created a map of human races. So he drew this very incredibly attractive but kind of bizarre map, mapping all these different races across the globe. He wanted to publish it by the Royal Society, but the Royal Society actually rejected the map, so it wasn't published. But it's still he self-published, and then he had a huge impact on scientific thinking. But the fact that the Royal Society refused to publish it shows that there was division among scholars at this time in their beliefs about race. Some rejected scientific racism altogether because they believed that all human beings were equal and that social change anywhere all over the world was possible, regardless of geography or nutrition or how people behaved. So scientific racism, though, gained great legs, and it was used to justify slavery and conquest, the seizure of indigenous lands all over the world. And at this time, actually, it was used to justify the seizure of indigenous lands on the Great Plains in the United States, especially at a time in which indigenous people were forced off their land and onto reservations. With the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species in 1859, American scientists decided that human institutions must be viewed through a lens of evolution, one of Darwin's concepts. So, because of either race or cultural practice, indigenous people were thought to be at an earlier stage of evolution. They're thought to be inferior in the development of the human race. It so happened that all of the inferior people all over the world happen to have dark skin, or vice versa. Everybody with dark skin was thought to be inferior. So the way people looked, their biology, and their cultural practice all became associated with status in the evolution of races. So, with after Darwin's publication and after that focus on evolution, anthropologists started to see indigenous people really as specimens deserving close study because they were thought to be certain moments in human evolution, and they're thought to be like living fossils. So they started actually to start digging up indigenous bones, indigenous graves all over North America. Also, indigenous corpses from all the wars that were taking place on the northern Great Plains at this time in the U.S. They were actually beheaded in order to feed this incredible demand for indigenous skulls in America's new natural history museums. So a lot of museums all over the United States started collecting these skulls and storing them and then studying them. And we're looking here at a picture, actually a current picture of how skulls are stored in the American Museum of Natural History. Secondly, anthropologists like to study living Indigenous peoples, to see the ways in which they lived. The public developed an appetite for gazing at Indigenous people, looking at Indigenous people. So, what I call ethnographic zoos became incredibly popular, and these were living history displays of Indigenous people engaged in their quote unquote everyday lives. So we can see a picture here actually of Indigenous people at a World Fair in 1905 in Belgium. So this practice actually continues on into the present day. And let's take a moment to look at this website, to look at this news story on an archaeologist who actually raided hundreds of Indigenous graves for his own personal museum. The mysterious Dr. Glidden, callous actions of archaeologists who raided hundreds of Native American graves to set up macabre museum, remembered in California. So a Santa Catalina Island museum has opened an exhibit on a self-styled archaeologist who dug up hundreds of local American Indian graves and made a tourist trap of their bones. The exhibit on Ralph Glidden's, says he, through his unscientific plundering, disregarded the sanctity of human remains and inflicted near permanent damage on research into local Native American life. The exhibit includes necklaces and other artifacts of the Tongva Indians who once lived in California and other Channel Islands. And let's take a look at what his museum actually looked like. This is the interior of the museum in Avalon, California, complete with bones and skulls from Native American burial grounds. Because anthropologists believe that Indigenous people belong to a primal stage in the development of modern civilization, the whole evolutionary process doomed them to extinction. So Indigenous people would have to change and then develop and catch up to the rest of civilization, and if they didn't, and if they tried to continue practicing their way of life, they would be doomed to die, not survive in the modern world. So, in the scientific perspective of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, Indigenous people represented then this separate racial type, a distinctive level of social development, a particular inferior stage in human evolution. Anthropologists then constructed this whole scenario of a continuum of human development, a social continuum. And that continuum was with the most primitive people at the bottom or the beginning to the most civilized people at the end. And Indigenous people fell on the early part of this continuum. So, in order to actually challenge and intervene and I guess upset this continuum, I'm constantly going to be referring to Indigenous civilizations rather than Indigenous cultures. And I encourage you to do that as well. So anthropologists thought that Indigenous people as primitive people couldn't stand up to or couldn't handle contact from more civilized people. So this is another reason why they were doomed to vanish. So the vanishing Indian displays became even more popular at world fairs and at museums. And here's another couple examples of Penobscot and Sioux at world fairs. So everybody wanted to rush and see what Indians were like before they died off. And the vanishing Indian idea also strongly dominated government policy towards Indigenous people. So I do want to underscore that all these ideas about race, all these theories about race in the 19th century were wrong. So of course there is no continuum from savagery to civilization. Of course people's social and cultural behavior was not determined by their blood. People could change. Race doesn't exist as a biological category, and it's a really flawed way about thinking about scientific variability among people. But I did want to tell you about this history of the construct of race because it was a social and cultural construct that still survives to the present day. I'd like to introduce our first guest speaker of the class. It's actually our teaching assistant for the class. Her name is Victoria Jackson. She's one of my doctoral students. She's doing her PhD dissertation on the history of Wendat or Huron people in southern Ontario. She's looking at Wendat people in the 17th century, and she's particularly interested in children in Wendat communities. But she is actually going to be talking to us today more about the history of the discipline of anthropology, because she's got a background in anthropology and archaeology. So welcome to Victoria.
The flawed scientific ideas surrounding the so-called vanishing Indian led to a particular style of conducting research, often called salvage anthropology. The idea here is to collect as much data as possible before the Indigenous peoples went extinct. Though, of course, Indigenous peoples did not go extinct, this idea also filtered into the way archaeology was conducted. Digs were constructed with the intention of collecting as much stuff as possible, with artifact collection being the most important goal. In other words, they wanted to save artifacts before they were all gone. Artifacts would then be displayed in museums for public consumption or stored until they could be of use to scientists. Amateur archaeologists also took part, creating their own private collections or selling items to collectors and museums. Now, besides the moral implications of this process, artifacts taken during this earlier form of archaeology were collected almost entirely for their aesthetic appeal, limiting the amount of information scientists could actually gain from these items. Provenance and context were sometimes lost, or in the case of amateur archaeologists, were often lost. Provenance being the artifact's physical location in the site, and context including its location in relation to other items. Now, without this information, historians and archaeologists today have difficulty using these items to determine the age and civilization that produced it, among other issues. And without those critical pieces of information, it can be difficult to correct any old assumptions regarding dating or categorization. This is what led to a lot of the misinformation we have today about early North America and its deep history. Change to the archaeological field came slowly, though. While some digs were more constructive than others, it wasn't until the 1950s and even the 1960s that archaeologists really started revisiting and making substantial changes to their method. While archaeologists had long since prided themselves on their science, a new group of archaeologists began formalizing and codifying the process. A processual paradigm emerged in archaeology, with archaeologists paying a special attention to process and method, as the name suggests. And I don't want to get into too many details of the theory, but the implications for the field were quite important. Archaeologists practicing this new archaeology tried different methods to make their work more scientific, many of which are still in practice today. And while they began paying more attention to context and location, and used that to improve their dating and categorization methods. So they began using scientific methods of observation and hypothesis testing, bringing the field in line with other forms of research, of scientific research. Ethnohistory, which uses historical information to contextualize the archaeological data, grew out of this processual period. Now, processualism gave the physical artifact primacy in the research, though. Many went so far as to suggest that the only unbiased information that could be gained in archaeological research was in information that could only be seen in the study of the object itself. Processualists were great at studying process of how things were made. So they were effective at noting how certain kinds of ceramics were made, or how tools were put together, etc. And they also tended to see culture as a system of component parts, with changes in one area affecting others in a ripple effect. However, processualism tended to ignore or downplay human agency, and tended to view cultures as static, suggesting that cultural change only occurred through outside stimulus. Processualism could not analyze abstract ideas very well, meaning that gender, ethnicity, and religion were left out of the discussion, and processualists tended to consider environment as highly deterministic in human cultures, meaning that they believed that environment rather than humans shape society. More importantly, though, processualists considered their work to be unbiased because it was rooted in scientific analysis. As such, they believed they could, by using scientific method, come to completely objective conclusions. And as historians, we know that every perspective is biased, even scientific ones. Almost immediately, then, a new group of archaeologists came along, criticizing the processualists, and these people became known creatively enough as post-processualists. Now, post-processualism was made up of different ideas, making it hard to define. But at the beginning, or right from the beginning rather, post-processualists were criticizing the idea of objective archaeology. They suggested that even if using the scientific method, archaeologists were still biased. Post-processualists criticized the emphasis on materialism that was so predominant in processualism, and they suggested that archaeologists could learn about past societies without relying entirely upon artifacts. They emphasized ideas and were more concerned with what artifacts meant to people, specifically to the people producing them, so that if they were analyzing an artifact, they were more likely to ask not how it was made or what it was made of, but how it was made, why it was made, and what ideas its maker was trying to convey. Now, to give you a sense of what this means in practice, take a piece of pottery. A processualist studying such an item might remark on the way it was made and the clay that went into it. For example, if they noted that the ceramic had a red color, they would expect that the clay was easily available either through local resources or trade connections, and that was the reason why this reddish clay, as opposed to a different color, was used in the ceramics. A post-processualist, on the other hand, might consider these things, but might also ask if that color had some larger cultural significance to the people making it, perhaps some kind of religious significance. Now, with their attention on human agency, rather than environmental determinism, post-processualism arguably led the way to a more ethical form of archaeology that encouraged marginalized peoples to participate in the field. Archaeologists focused on social agency tended to accept that people negotiated with their culture, emphasizing that individuals and individual choices were just as important to the way societies changed and developed. And as part of this turn towards social agency came a development of feminist archaeology and indigenous archaeology. Now, in Canada today, most digs are organized by larger organizations that follow specific rules and regulations to take into consideration these social, material, and ideational issues. As such, elements of each of these paradigms remain in some form or another in almost all archaeological studies. But why am I telling you all this? Archaeology, like any academic discipline, is constantly changing. Knowing how archaeologists are coming to their conclusions and what kinds of things they're looking for, or not looking for, affects the outcome of their studies, just as it does in history. A significant portion of our knowledge of ancient North America comes from archaeological studies. Without the development of a rigid scientific process, which grew out of the processual movement, we would have very little sense of the broader chronology. And without the ideational turn in post-processualism, we might be less aware of how personal agency and social issues affect the development of these civilizations' material cultures. And without the turn to social agency, a lot of the collaborative efforts made in today's archaeology, for example, the consult of Indigenous peoples when doing digs dealing with Indigenous sites, this might not be so prevalent today.